I'll wait a couple minutes here while we're waiting. So, welcome. We're just waiting for people to log on. It looks like people are starting to chime in. All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen and I'll do the intro to the talk, intro objectives like I usually do, and then we'll get started. So, this always takes a second, this transition. All right, I am screen sharing. Great. Well, welcome everybody. Today we are going to talk about dispelling healthy food myths. So this one's going to be kind of fun. Hopefully you learn something you didn't know beforehand, or I'm hoping relearn something the correct way. All right, so as you know, I always like to start with a bit of intro and objectives. My name is Mary. I am a dietitian. I have a master's degree in nutrition and over 4 years of experience in the health and nutrition field. So I have a little bit of expertise to lean on for this talk. And today we're going to talk about common food myths about healthy foods. And so today I really wanted to stick with more of like the food agriculture, kind of grocery store, food label kind of vibe. If we want to do, common nutrition myths, I'm happy to do that in another one. But today we're just going to stick with more on like the food side. So because of that, we're going to, the first myth we're going to talk about is that all processed foods are bad. So we'll kind of dive into Hey guys, technical difficulties. Sometimes that happens. I get booted out. That's okay. We're bouncing back. I will reshare my screen. All right. All right. So the next myth we're going to talk about is don't eat foods if you don't recognize the food on the label. We'll talk about maybe why that's not always true. Next, we're going to talk about our food supply and the fact that the myth that it is less safe than other countries because we have ingredients that we use that other countries ban. So I've seen this one on social media a lot. If you follow any food pages, this one comes up a lot. So we will talk about that. We'll talk about claims on food labels and food packages and whether or not they're true all the time. And lastly, we're going to talk about organic and if eating organic is really the best. So this series and when we do these talks, we really want them to be as interactive as we can. And so I'm the only one who can talk, but if you look on your screen, you should see like an ask questions or a questions bar. So feel free to go ahead and just put a question in that chat. Towards the end, I will get to them. And, it can be about this topic, or if you just have a regular nutrition question, we have enough time at the end where I can answer those questions as well. So feel free to just put something in that chat box. All right, the first we're going to talk about is the myth that all processed foods are bad. So I think in order to kind of start this one, we have to answer that question of, what does processing mean? So, because a lot of times we think people Sorry, it really does not like me today. I'll try sharing the screen one more time, and if it boots me off again, then I just won't share the screen and I'll just read my PowerPoint that I have up in front of me, and you guys are just gonna have to stare at me and my office background. So I will try one more time. This has happened a couple other times, but usually it remedies itself pretty quickly. Wow. Oh, I am sharing it. I thought it booted me again. All right, awesome. Okay, so we have to think about what is processing. So all the word processing means, especially when we're talking about food, is we're talking about a food that has undergone any change from its natural state. And this can be a whole host of things that are really not bad for us at all. And in fact, we'll talk about a couple that actually make the food supply healthier for us. So the first one is processing includes any physical change you make. So that means canned foods, canning, cooking, chopping, milling. So when we make bread, all bread is processed because the flour has to be milled. And so yeah, all bread is processed, but that doesn't mean it's bad. The next thing another category of things we add into our food supply is preservatives. And so preservatives, their primary role, which I'll talk about in the next bullet, is fighting bacteria and actually keeping our food supply not only safer for us, but making it last a little bit longer. It preserves it, right? So salt and vinegar, things like that, are processing. And so just a little salt is bad for us, but that is also a way that we process our foods. Hi.
Mary, I think the slides aren't showing. You might as well just use the camera. Yeah,
Okay.
there we go. Okay.
Okay. Hate when that happens. So what a bummer. I had so many cool pictures on this one for you guys. Well, that's okay. I'll just try to describe them. So where was I? Preservatives, right? So preservatives are a way that we process our food. Not necessarily a bad thing. It actually makes our food and our food supply a little bit healthier for us. Next, yeah, things like pasteurization as well. That's something we do to our milk and our dairy to fight all the bad bacteria that could be in it. Very healthy for us. And the last one I wanted to talk about is additives and emulsifiers. So we'll talk about this a little bit later. That is a way that we process our food, but it also makes our food taste better. It enhances the flavor and it also enhances the texture for us as well. So, processing food, not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, like I said, it would be really hard to get away from having processed food in your diet. So, myth busted, not all processed food is bad for us. So, next we have our next food myth is don't eat foods if you don't recognize the food on the label. I'm sure all of us have heard some version of this myth from time to time. And because a lot of our processed foods will have some things on the label we just don't recognize. I wish I could see your hands, but sodium chloride, that's a really common preservative in our food, not be a food you recognize. However, that's table salt. That's just the chemical name for it, sodium chloride. Something like sodium benzoate. That can be kind of intimidating. It doesn't sound that great. It's just an antimicrobial that keeps the threshold of microbial contaminants down in our food and it makes it safer for us. Or something like absorbic acid. We're like, whoa, that's kind of a weird word. All that is vitamin C. So it's just the chemical name for it, like sodium chloride. So those are just some examples of things that we'll find really commonly on our food label that might kind of scare us. And if we believed that myth of don't eat foods if you don't recognize the things on the label, that might leave out a lot of foods for you. And so that is not a myth we want to listen to all the time. There's also words that we might not know. I had an example of a food label on here, and I think the food is, what is it? Oh, potassium sorbate. And so that, I think it kind of sounds like a sorbet. But potassium sorbate is just something that manufacturers will put into foods to make them last longer. So this food label that I had on here was hummus. And I don't know about you guys, but I want that to last a while. And if you've ever tried making hummus at home, it's probably good for maybe 4 or 5 days before it kind of gets a weird taste and smell, and you notice that there's probably some bacteria in there. But, if I'm going to spend $6 on a tub of hummus, I would rather have that last a couple weeks than 4 days. So manufacturers will put things in it like potassium sorbate in this case to make it last a little bit longer. And that way, us as consumers, we get a little bit more bang for our buck, and the manufacturing companies can get a product that lasts a little bit longer and that's a little bit fresher. So that's something we maybe wouldn't recognize on the food label, but it is something that is completely fine and not harmful to us at all. So that is a myth that I really would not believe anymore. Hopefully you don't either. So the next myth we have on here is our food supply is less safe than other countries because we use ingredients they ban. So I don't know about any of you, but if you follow any like nutrition people on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, wherever you get your information, and you see these viral pictures go around, I see it all the time. And I had a couple on the slides, but it'll be like a picture of Doritos in the US and then Doritos in Europe. And you'll see that there's foods on the US that they say are banned in Europe. And the point that they're trying to make with this is that our food supply is less safe or less regulated because we have foods in it that other countries ban. And so that is not an accurate conclusion to draw from that. And I'll explain. So different countries around the world use different approaches for banning food or banning ingredients in our food. So in the US, we do something called a risk approach. And other countries around the world, they do hazard. And so what that means is, let's say you're standing on the beach, and you see a shark in the water. The shark is the hazard, it's in the ocean. So you're not going to go in the ocean and you're like, nope, I'm done with that ocean forever. There are sharks. A risk approach, so that means a hazard approach is what other countries take, meaning that if any ingredient has any relationship to any disease at all, they ban it. They'll just ban it right out, and they're just like, nope, done. We're done with it. In the US, we take a risk approach, meaning that we take into account not only, okay, this ingredient may cause harm, but at what dose, at what exposure do we need for it to create harm? And so in our food supply, we will have things that may cause harm, but only at a certain dose. If they're way down here, they're completely fine. So let's say there's an ingredient that, this X ingredient, and if it is at 10 milligrams, then that is when it is harmful. So in our food supply, we'll have it below 10. We'll have it at 1 or 2, but we'll still have it. Whereas Europe, they'll just take it out. Nobody will have it. So it's kind of the difference in those two approaches. One isn't better than the other. One, isn't safer than the other. They're just two different ways of looking at it. So it doesn't mean, back to our myth, it doesn't mean our food supply is less safe because we have these things. It just means it's different. So that's the only thing. So myth busted. Our food supply is not less safe than Europe because of banned ingredients. We just see it differently. We approach it a little bit differently here in the US. All right, so our next myth is about claims on food labels. So our myth is that all claims on food labels, front and back, packaged food, all over, all of those are true. And I think if you guys are catching on, the answer is it depends. So we have our food in the US is very, very well regulated, especially our packaged food. So if you have, if you're in your kitchen right now, or next time you go to the grocery store and you notice that on most foods, there's kind of like a front and a back. And the back is called our food label or a nutrient label. And that is really, really well regulated. All the ingredients are really well regulated, and there's a lot of rules and laws around that, as well as all the nutrients and all the nutrition. Very well regulated. The front, however, is a little bit different. So we see some claims. There's different types of claims that are regulated by different people. But things like whenever you look at a food label and it says it will lower your cholesterol, or it's low sodium, or a good source of stuff like that, those are actually regulated. Foods that are not going to be words that are not going to be regulated on our food supply are actually a little surprising. And it's going to be the foods that are the words that are really vague are actually not regulated. So words like healthy, free range, natural, hormone free, grass fed, and superfood, all of those words are actually not regulated. So companies can just put those foods on those words on their foods and nobody cares. So something like healthy, that seems kind of weird, right? You would think that there would be rules around calling something healthy or not. Well, they're actually slowly starting to change that, but foods can claim to be healthy even if they're not. That's why it's a really important skill to be able to look at the back of your food label and make that decision for yourself. I am happy to do a video on food label or answer any food label questions if they come up in the chat, but we're not really going to talk about that today. So something else that we are going to talk about in our next video on supplements is supplements are actually really not regulated at all. In fact, the ingredients in supplements are not regulated. The FDA doesn't really look into them. So companies can kind of say things, whatever they want is in there and whatever claims they want to make. When it comes to functional foods like supplements and green powders and everything like that, not very well regulated, much less than food. So, but that is something I'll talk about next on our next video on supplements. So this myth, all claims on packaged food is true. It's kind of true. It's probably the closest to true of the myths we've talked about today. All right, so my last one is going to be eating organic. And so the myth is eating organic is the best option. And that is actually going to be very false. This one is probably the most false myth that I'm going to talk about today. So the term organic is really just talking about, it's an agricultural term, and it's talking about how the food is grown. And the USDA has certain qualifications, and foods just have to meet that qualification to be considered organic. It's really talking about, the soil and the processing. And it just means that when it comes to like weed control and pest control, they're using certain types of pesticides. It doesn't mean they don't use pesticides. They just use certain types that are labeled organic. So organic pesticides tend to be more natural pesticides, and conventional growing tends to be synthetic. But that's kind of all it is. It's really just talking about, it's an agricultural term talking about how things are grown. So the research between if organic is better for you than conventionally grown things, it really is just kind of hit or miss. It seems to be that conventional foods and organic foods are pretty much the same when it comes to if they're better for you. And one thing I did want to show, I wonder if anyone has seen this going viral at all, this idea of the dirty dozen. That's something that tends to go around on Instagram. I always see it on my nutrition pages or hear people talking about it. The dirty dozen just refers to, so this company every year puts out this list, and it's going to be the top 12 foods that have the most pesticides. And they put out this list and they say, these are the foods that you need to eat organically. And so what these lists really do, and what this company does when they make this list, is they just look at its universally provided and publicly provided information from the FDA on foods that have the most different number of pesticides on them. That's it. They don't take into account how much pesticide or the amount of pesticide, just the fact that there are all these different types of pesticides. But then if you dig a little bit deeper, and people have done this, and they say, okay, fine, these foods have pesticides on them. Let's calculate how much food of this food you would have to eat for that to be toxic. right? Because that's the whole point they're trying to make is these pesticides, you eat them and they're bad for you. So then people said, okay, let's test that. And how much would you have to eat for this to be bad for you? So here's some examples. One of the foods that comes up on this list time and time again is strawberries. So the people who did these calculations and answered that question, how many strawberries would you have to eat for this to be bad for you? So you would have to eat about 400 servings of strawberries for it to be the minimum amount of bad for you. You would have to eat almost 700 servings of grapes for it to be bad for you. You'd have to eat, what is that, 20,000 servings of celery, I think, for it to be bad for you. So this dirty dozen, yes, these are the foods that have the most pesticides. However, you would have to eat hundreds of servings of these foods for them to be bad for you. So I think the intention of this dirty dozen list is to convince people to buy organic. I think if you really dig into it, this is a list of 12 foods that are the reason why our food supply is so safe, is that even the dirtiest of foods are still, you would have to eat almost 500 servings for it to be bad. So this myth, eating organic is best, I really don't see, for the cost, I really don't see any reason why it would be the best. And I think we've shown even the dirty dozen, still just as fine as the conventional food supply. So my final thoughts when we're thinking about these myths, especially these like agriculture kind of food related myths, is that sometimes people try to make things sound worse than they actually are to scare you so that you will spend your money on something else. So I would be really hesitant when someone tells you something about the food supply that seems really, really bad. I would hesitate for a second. I would take in that information and I would go look and see what more trusted sources would say. I think the USDA, the CDC, hospitals, universities, they're going to be a really quick and easy place to look at to answer some of these questions. And I would hesitate about listening to anyone who gives you information that they also make money off of. So my first thought is, listen to the experts. I found a ton of great sources here today that had some really great information that was, not trying to scare people, which I think a lot of these myths try to do. And they had some just great info. When we think about processed foods, they may get a bad rap, but they really do make our lives a lot easier. I don't know how many of you would like to mill flour and bake your own bread rather than just going out and buying bread. So processed food, it really is a convenience thing. It makes our lives a lot easier. And just because something's processed doesn't mean it's bad. I wouldn't personally pay more for organic foods if you don't really want to. If eating organic is something that's important to you, we have kind of looked at the science behind it, and that is a decision you can make. Let's see. And our food supply is very safe. The preservatives that we put in there can help us keep the microbial content or the bacteria lower in our food. It makes it safer, makes it taste better, it gives it better texture. So preservatives in and of themselves are not a bad thing. And lastly, especially when it comes to the front of a food label or a supplement, I would not believe everything that I see. Or every claim that is made. So those are my final thoughts for food myths. Remember, if you have any questions for me, and they don't just have to be about the myths we've talked about today, it can be other generic nutrition questions. We have a little bit of extra time here. So I'm going to go ahead and look at our questions, see if anyone put any in. Awesome. Okay. What are some preservatives or additives we need to be really careful about and not buy a product if it has any in it? That's a really good question. I think when it comes to that, the only one I've really ever seen that's something you just absolutely should not have would be trans fat. And trans fat, for the most part, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, has really been taken out of our food supply. So there isn't a ton of trans fat left, but that would be the one thing I would be like, absolutely 0% of that should be in your food. Other than that, it really kind of depends on the amount. Salt is something that is so natural and can be really good in small doses, but you eat something with 1,500 milligrams of salt in it, and that's going to be way too much. So for the most part, you want to make sure any of those preservatives or additives, those may be big words that we don't really know. I don't even know all of them, and I work in this industry. We want to make sure when they're on our ingredients list, they're going to be at the bottom of our ingredients list. That's how we can make sure there's not a ton. So when you look at the back of a food label, the ingredients are listed in a quantity by weight. So the things at the top are the most abundant in the food, and the things towards the bottom are going to be the least. So one thing we just want to make sure is any of those big words that we see, we want them to be a little bit closer to the bottom. Are only certain decaf coffees safe, like water, decaf process, or is all decaf coffee in the US safe? Yeah, I have no problem with decaf coffee. I have not run into anything that says that's something we want to limit. It's pretty much just coffee without the caffeine in it. So I haven't seen anything that would make me think we would want to cut back on that. What percentage of diet is okay to be processed or ultra processed? Great question. So, processed, like I said, it is going to be really tough to have absolutely no processed food in our diets. It's going to be really hard. That's just basically all raw fruits and vegetables. So, we want to think about the amount of processing. So we want to eat most of our foods in the minimally processed to unprocessed category. That is going to be where we're going to get the most bang for our buck, some really great stuff. And then there's kind of like medium processed. I can't remember what the exact word is for it. And then the ultra processed is going to be like a lot of salt and sugar and preservatives and chopping and heating and drying. Those are going to be our ultra processed foods. Those we're just going to want to keep to a minimum. If I was going to put a percentage on that, maybe like 10 to 20% of our food we would want ultra processed. Some of the ultra processed foods tend to be our favorite anyway, like pizzas and ice creams. And so we're going to want to find a balance that works for us, but definitely, like it kind of says here, keeping those ultra processed foods on the lower end. Okay, risk method. Danger level is 10, 1 milligram per serving. There's 12 serving, entire product. So when it comes to the risk method, a lot of our foods, so we can think back to the Dirty Dozen, right? And when, it says we need to eat 400 servings of it. So that's a lot of where you're going to see those risk calculations is you would have to eat a ton of it. I would have to look into like specific foods to really be able to answer that question. But I see where you're getting at is like it's only 1 milligram, but you eat 10 servings of it. So then or 12 servings of it. So then it's 12 milligrams and the danger level was at 10. I promise you, none of them get really that close. You would have to eat really obscene amounts of it in order for things to be toxic. How bad is saturated fat? That's also a great question. So saturated fat, all these words mean is that talks about the chemical bonds of the fat. And so it means it's just really saturated. It's saturated with carbon or hydrogen. So it's just kind of a type of fat that kind of leads to, more of those cardiovascular risks. Saturated fat actually, those are going to come from our meat sources, from butter, from dairy and cheeses, or dairy is cheese, milks and cheeses, right? So saturated fat, we would want to keep on the lower side of our diet, but how bad is it is kind of a tough question to ask. It kind of depends on like amount you want to eat. I would say when it comes to our types of fat, trans fat's obviously going to be the worst. Saturated fat, we're going to want to keep a little bit lower, and our unsaturated fats are going to be like our nuts and seeds and avocado, and our healthier fats. We would want to eat more of those, and our lean fats. So I would say if you're thinking like ratios, your unsaturated fat you want to eat more of. Saturated fat aren't inherently bad, but we would want to keep them a little bit less and try to get some of our leaner proteins and our leaner fats. Do you agree that canola oil is ultra processed and should be avoided? So I agree with half of that sentence. I agree that canola oil is ultra processed, but that doesn't mean it should be avoided. So that's why initially I was thinking that I was going to talk about like ultra processed foods are the ones we want to stay away from and da 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 da. But it really can be so tough. There are some ultra processed foods that can be good for us. Like canola oil is a fine oil to use, especially if you're frying things, because it has a really low smoke point. So if I ever fry things at home, canola oil and vegetable oils are the oils that I use. So I wouldn't say just because it's ultra processed, it needs to be avoided. What is your opinion on taking apple cider vinegar for digestion? You know, I actually used to do this. My grandfather swore by this. I think this is something the science is still out on it. We're still trying to wrap our heads around, you know, is this a really good digestive, you know, can this kind of help us metabolize and process things? We're still trying to figure that out. Actually, the university I did my master's in, one of the professors was like the lady on this, and she was really trying to answer this question. And so right now, I think all we can really say is do what works for you. If you take a, you know, little tablespoon of apple cider vinegar and it helps you, then go for it. For me, it actually gave me really bad acid reflux, so I stopped doing it. But if you notice a difference, you know, while scientists are still trying to figure out the science behind it. So I say, you know, just go for it. If it works for you, then great. If not, and you get acid reflux like me, then maybe it's something you reevaluate. All right, so it looks like I have answered all the questions that are in here. It doesn't look like any more are popping up. So thank you all for coming to my talk tonight. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but we still made it through. 2 weeks from now, we are going to be tackling supplements. And, you know, we'll talk about some stuff with that. So have a great, I'm just double checking one more time. Okay, yep, nothing. All right, have a great rest of your night, everybody. Bye, thank you.